Over the 1,000-year-long battle against the Dark Lord Dracula, many have risen up from multiple different families in order to try to defeat him. Yet, only one champion to humanity has been around since the very beginning. Though this ally to man is no man themselves, but a weapon, an alchemical bane created to hunt all things undead, and ironically forged from the knowledge of its centuries-long rival. This is the legend of the Vampire Killer Whip.
I swear to you, no more will suffer your fate!
The Vampire Killer has a long and interesting history throughout the Castlevania series, as it has existed in multiple clans' families, and has helped slay evil all across those 1,000 years. Though its origin is actually very interesting, starting first in nothing more than a humble item shop located outside the castle of the Dark Lord Walter Bernhardt, the head vampire before Dracula rose. It rested on display as nothing more than a regular alchemical whip, created by a man named Ronaldo using the magic of the Crazed family text, which is funny, but we'll get into that later. It was originally created to kill both Ronaldo's daughter, who was afflicted with vampirism, and the Dark Lord Walter himself, but he found that the alchemical whip had no effect on the Dark Lord, though Ronaldo was allowed to live outside the castle, as Walter found Ronaldo's use of magic items to be very interesting and would make for a fun addition to his game, as Ronaldo would arm adventurers with magic items to challenge Walter, making Walter's time as a Dark Lord less boring. Then enters Leon Belmont of the Belmont clan, who came to the castle grounds in search of Walter in order to reclaim his betrothed, Sarah. Ronaldo, knowing the power of the whip and its effectiveness against the undead and how the undead fill up Walter's domain, offered Leon to use it in his pursuit of Sarah. And then after Leon found Sarah, he then learned she too was inflicted with vampirism. It is here that Ronaldo informs Leon that he might actually be able to complete the alchemical whip, as if he uses the whip in turn with a spell from the Crazed family's tome, it could combine the slaying abilities of the whip with that of a tainted soul, allowing the whip to finally be able to truly harm vampires. But he would need the soul of someone he trusted, and after informing Sarah about this, she agrees to the process, hoping her sacrifice will save others.
All becomes one in infinity. The tainted soul joins his. Undesired and cursed soul. His blood accepts your hatred for the power to slay your kind. Now, use the whip against Sarah!
I swear to you, no more will suffer your fate!
Thank you, Leon.
And such was the birth of the Vampire Killer Whip. Though the slaying capabilities of this whip don't actually stop at just vampires or Dark Lords. The whip is able to harm Death himself as well, meaning that the whip is strong enough to harm just about anything, be them demon, Dark Lord, Holy Servant, it doesn't matter. The whip is now a bane to all paranormal. Along with this, Leon also claims that the whip itself still has a bit of a personality, as Leon claims that he can feel emotions coming from the whip, which is likely the spirit of Sarah trying to lead the wielder of the whip down the right path. Though from its uses throughout the series, we can see that Sarah is rather picky when it comes to her wielders, which is actually rather familiar to another Dark Lord slaying weapon from a different series, but we'll talk about that some other time. Alongside this, since the whip itself originates from that of an alchemical whip, it means it can change its shape at will, which fully explains why in certain games the whip shifts between a leather whip to a chain whip and is also growing or losing a flail at times. Though the most ironic thing about the Vampire Killer is the fact that it was help created by the man it would then continue to hunt for 1,000 years, as the alchemical whip design is based off of Matthias Krukvert's family's teaching. Matthias would then go on to use these teachings to create a Crimson Stone, which he then used to become the Dark Lord Dracula after the death of Walter Bernhardt, meaning that Matthias, in his desperate pursuit of immortality in spite of God, created a weapon that would slay him time and time again from 1094 and would seal his doom in 1999. Though, before we can even get to 1999, the whip must first have been passed down a multitude of generations along this 1,000-year journey, with the first person to note to have the whip passed down to them being Trevor Belmont in the 1400s, roughly 300 years after Leon made his vow to hunt the night. Trevor was approached as a last-ditch effort to finally put an end to Dracula for the first time, as prior to all this, Leon's descendants had only been able to hold off the Dark Lord instead of actually finishing him. Trevor is the first to actually succeed and go on and kill Dracula. He then would take up the whip for a second mission and investigate a possible early resurrection of the man where he met Hector, the Devil Forge Master. And from here, the whip would then pass down to Christopher Belmont, who would defeat Dracula after his first full-fledged revival. Though the soul of Dracula lingered and then possessed the son of Christopher Belmont right before the vampire killer was passed down to him. But Christopher was able to cleanse his son of Dracula and continue on the family lineage. Though Christopher's son, since he was possessed by Dracula, was never able to truly use the whip correctly, which means when a servant of Dracula rose up to avenge his fallen master, Christopher's son wasn't able to defend himself correctly. But his son, Desmond Belmont, was able to pick up the whip and use it to its full potential, unlocking its full power after killing the servant that slayed his dad, along with re-banishing a Dracula who was attempting to revive himself. And from here, the whip would go on to meet one of the biggest players in its history, Desmond's grandson, Simon Belmont. Who would go on to not only slay Dracula twice, but also show that the honorableness in vampire slaying and utter dedication to the eradication of evil counteracts the whip's pickiness when it comes to its users, as even after being cursed by Dracula, Vampire Killer continues to work effectively when Simon goes to slay Dracula for a second time. This is the first demonstration on how each Belmont is greater than the last. Then after Simon's journey, he goes on to pass down his whip to his grandson, Juste Belmont. Juste Belmont is the peak of both of his family's bloodlines, demonstrated by his unique mixture of the Vampire Killer whip's slaying capabilities and the magic of his Fernandez side. The reason he picks up the whip is actually to go save one of his close friends, though in his adventures he finds himself facing off against the Wrath of Dracula, a spirit created by the relics of Dracula, though Juste banishes it with relative ease. Though Juste may hold the title as one of the strongest Belmonts in the family, since he never faced off against the real Dracula, his role in the Vampire Killer's legend is nowhere near as important as his son's, Richter Belmont. Richter Belmont is probably one of the most important Belmonts to the whip's legacy, if not the whole series in general, as Richter followed in his father's footsteps as not only being the most powerful Belmont of his family, but he also brought Dracula and his whole army to their knees, being physically talented mixed in with his youthful hot-bloodedness. Richter was just too much for Dracula and his horde of the undead to handle, as he possessed the heart of Leon, the talent of Juste, the drive of Simon. He was everything the whip ever wanted, and he slayed Dracula after his third full resurrection. Though this drive to defeat Dracula with a hot-blooded fury is what actually caused Richter's downfall in the end, as he fell to mind control 4 years later after slaying Dracula by one of Dracula's minions, Shaft. He was placed under a mesmerization spell, which locked in his desire to try to slay Dracula and all the evil forces, which is why Richter attempts to resurrect Dracula a century early, so he can continue to fight the man forever.
Count Dracula rises but once every century, and my role is over. If I can resurrect him, then the battle will last for eternity.
Thankfully, the illusion was shattered and Richter came to his senses. Afterward, Richter decided not to pass down the Vampire Killer to his descendants, as after seeing the dangers of his own fall, and learning about Nostradamus' prediction about the end of Dracula, he chose instead to entrust the whip to other clans to fight Dracula while the Belmonts waited and rested. But before doing so, he used magic to place an echo of himself within the whip. That way, if anyone tried to claim the whip itself, they would have to face off against Richter, who, according to Alucard, is unmatched in vampire killing potential, meaning all who wield the whip after him are as strong, if not stronger than him. The first family that the Vampire Killer was handed off to was the Schneider Clan, who are technically Belmonts in blood, but are a branch off of the clan itself. And during this time, the whip is actually still considered technically lost, mainly because there are arguments whether or not the Schneider family's existence is canon or not, though the games that they star in don't actually conflict with anything in the canon timeline and actually fit perfectly along the path, so I choose to accept them as such. The whip first ends up in the hands of Michael Geralt Schneider, but he doesn't really do any adventuring and only holds onto the whip, keeping it safe until his son, Reinhardt Schneider, a gentle soul with a strong heart and body, was able to take up the mantle. Though Reinhardt was only able to defeat an imposter Dark Lord, he did show that the world of monsters is slowly changing, as he not only befriended a vampire girl named Rose, but he also saved her from suicide and the two fell passionately in love with each other. Afterwards, Reinhardt, confident in the future of the world, retires from vampire hunting, passing the whip onto another clan. And the clan Reinhardt ended up passing it on to was the Morris clan. The first to obtain the whip is John Morris, who was actually unable to use the whip to its true potential without draining his own lifespan, as we later learn that the bloodline of the Belmont is very closely tied to the vampire killer's power, likely due to Sarah's spirit rejecting any non-descendant of Leon. Though Jonathan Morris, the son of John Morris, was the closest person to being able to unlock the full potential of the whip without sacrificing their life in the process. As using the power of another clan, Jonathan was able to face off against the spirit of Richter inside of the whip. Though, after truly unlocking its potential, he makes a point not to overuse the weapon until he faces off against Dracula. And with his mission complete, Jonathan holds onto the whip until 1999. When the vampire killer returns home for the first time in centuries, as the Morris clan returns the whip to Julius Belmont. Only 19 at the time, yet he's able to naturally reclaim the whip and use its ability to slay Dracula once and for all, then using its power to help seal away the castle during the solar eclipse, closing the book on the whip's 1,000-year journey, killing the man who helped create it for the last time, all while holding true to the first wielder's final words.
From this day on, the Belmont clan will hunt the night!
If you enjoyed this video and want to see more videos like it in the future, I have a Patreon at patreon.com/MannyNotTheBadGuy. And if you want to forge your own vampire killing whip of your own, well, you first should go and buy a copy of Shimonetta at buyshimonetta.com.